Hello all, welcome back yet again for our fifth and yes, final installment of our Chapter 14 lecture series. This section is entitled Turning Points and Conclusion. The focus question for this section is, what were the military and political turning points of the war? The war's outcome was very much in doubt for much of its third and fourth years. However, two particular events in 1863 can, in hindsight, be pinpointed as particular turning points in the war to the favor of the Union side. First was the Battle of Vicksburg, which took place from May to July of 1863. Vicksburg was a key port along the Mississippi River and one of the last Confederate outposts on that crucial waterway. After various land assaults failed, Ulysses S. Grant launched a successful siege of Vicksburg by land and by river, which is what the image you see here is illustrating. Once Vicksburg was captured, the entire Mississippi Valley region was now controlled by the Union, in particular that crucially important Mississippi River waterway that was the nexus of trade in the region and for much of the Confederacy. Second, the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place from July 1st to 3rd, 1863. This was Lee's second attempt to invade the North, and it resulted in a clash that was the largest battle ever fought in North America, with massive casualties. And again, like the previous Southern attempt to invade the North at the Battle of Antietam, the Southerners failed at the Battle of Gettysburg and were forced to retreat, never again to set foot in Northern soil during the war. After Ulysses S. Grant's successful siege of Vicksburg, he was appointed as commander of the Union armies facing Robert E. Lee in Virginia. And Grant began a war of attrition. Ulysses S. Grant was willing to incur high numbers of casualties to win battles. It was an all-or-nothing effort for Grant. He took advantage of Union manpower to justify this sort of tactic. And for one example, from May to June of 1864, the Union had 60,000 casualties compared to the Confederates' 30,000 casualties, which, was based on sheer numbers. One would assume the Confederates had the upper hand in that. But again, the Union could technically afford to lose much more men than the Confederates did, especially by this stage of the war. The Confederate manpower was dwindling ever so quickly. This period also saw really the rise of trench warfare that began to resemble more and more like the later trench warfare that took place in World War I in Europe. And this, again, is another sign of the modernization of warfare that began in this period. Just as important as Grant's efforts in Virginia in 1864 were General William Tecumseh Sherman's efforts in Georgia and the Carolinas in that same year. General Sherman captured Atlanta, a key southern city, in September of 1864, and from there began his infamous march to the sea. From Atlanta, Sherman's army marched through Georgia all the way to the coast to Savannah, wreaking total destruction and devastation along the way. Total warfare. And he did the same thing moving from Savannah up north through South Carolina, where South Carolina was particularly targeted harshly by Sherman's troops because many Union soldiers and the Union in general blamed South Carolina for instigating the war to start with. Sherman's Lincoln's success in Georgia and South Carolina pinned Lee's army between him and Grant in Virginia and devastated Confederate morale. Lincoln's re-election in 1864 proved to be another crucial turning point in the war. This election pitted George McClellan, the same George McClellan that had briefly commanded Union armies in Virginia in the early stages of the war, was the Democratic candidate, and Lincoln, despite some opposition from the radical Republicans of the period who wanted to elect John C. Fremont, or nominate John C. Fremont, Lincoln was able to secure the Republican nomination. And really the central issue between the two candidates at this time was between continued war with the Confederacy on one side and peace with the Confederacy on the other. And for quite a while, Lincoln and his supporters were very reticent about their chances for re-election, as the war was not going so well and there were growing calls for peace with the Confederacy. However, Sherman's victory in Atlanta and his march to Savannah helped to bolster Union morale greatly. They could begin to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that victory was not only possible but probable at that point. And this helped to secure Lincoln's ultimate victory in that election. Lincoln's win also ensured the war would continue until the Confederacy was crushed. After Grant's victories in Virginia in 1864 and Sherman's victories in Georgia and the Carolinas also in 1864, Union victory was all but assured by that point. In January of 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which officially abolished slavery throughout the Union. In April of 1865, Union troops captured the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, and Grant's armies chased Lee all the way across Virginia, where he was ultimately forced to surrender on April 9th, 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. 5 days later, Lincoln was assassinated by Confederate loyalist actor John Wilkes Booth, who was perhaps the Tom Cruise of his day. He was an extremely famous stage and theater actor and was also, of course, a loyal Confederate sympathizer at the time. The implications and the ramifications of the American Civil War have echoed throughout the rest of American history and is an issue that is still hotly debated and contested to this very day. However, there are some particular points that need to be highlighted to understand its fundamental alterations of the trajectory of American history. First, the Civil War laid the foundations for modern America. It increased the power of the federal government. Centralization of power fundamentally altered the dynamic between the federal government and state governments and established the U.S. as a full-fledged nation-state in and of itself. More people also began to look to the federal government to address social and economic issues, something that previously had been deemed outside of the purview of much government government activity or intervention. It accelerated the modernization of the northern economy and also created new problems for this idea of free labor. Was the modern industrial worker, slave to the machine, slave to the clock, truly free? These were questions that would continue to be debated. And of course, slavery's destruction was one of the ultimate outcomes of the Civil War. And it also signaled the beginning of the long, slow process of gaining and, more critically, maintaining full rights for African Americans in American society. Well, that's it, folks. We did it. We made it to the end of our Chapter 14 lecture series. As usual, I hope you learned a lot. Study hard, and I'll see you next time.